So the core of mysticism is self-inquiry, self-investigation, and I think it's really useful just to be clear about that, because over the last 50, 60 years since this kind of idea of the eon changeover, the Piscean era changing to the Aquarian era, around the 60s, particularly in the West, more and more kind of mystical schools have emerged and all sorts of new therapies have emerged, and it's just a massive kind of, just a mess in some ways. And I can imagine kind of, being younger and thinking, how this is really interesting, but what's it all about? How do I connect therapy with Vajrayana mysticism, with Tantra, with Rosicrucianism, Jewish Kabbalah, whatever, and really something very useful to understand, like I'm saying, is that it's all about self-investigation. That's the core of mysticism. That's the absolute core. The degree to which you can investigate this apparent sense of self that you have, entirely determines what might be called mystical or spiritual progress. And what really is this ego in kind of modern day terms? Well, I see it's like something that runs in the hardware of our brain, the frontal lobe is this new bit of the brain up here that particularly distinguishes us from our primate forebears, chimpanzees and that kind of thing. There's this sense that there's a limited me living inside my head, looking out at the world, experiencing life. And essentially this is a kind of simulation. It's like a virtual user, it's called sometimes. It's an artifact of the way that we've learned to attach onto thinking. It creates this sense of limited selfhood, and then, this limited selfhood can be expanded by kind of giving attributes to it, the kind of person that I am, the kind of limited being that I am. And this is constantly reinforced by the culture we're in, and it was created in our childhood, the way we got our name, and we learned how to become a person, to fit in with the culture that we were brought up in. And it's not that there's anything massively wrong with it, but if you're attracted to something deeper or more mystical, you need to develop the capacity to at least start to dissolve this sense of a limited inner being, that lives inside of you, that is you, essentially. And in case that sounds a bit scary, it doesn't mean that it goes away entirely, but it's more like you can dissolve it. You can just let go of it, and you can bring it back when you need to. Something also to understand here is that all human cultures are quite strongly instrumentalizing, and by that I mean that, say for example in the West, we're brought up to function well, to be good at work, to create, GDP for the country that we're born in, so that it can be a powerful country. And of course we have other needs, as primates essentially, but we are instrumentalized in that direction. It's all about functioning. It's all about what I do, not who I am. And that's because the culture, it's rather like a macro-organism. Individual countries are like macro-organisms, and they use people basically to maintain themselves. It's almost like, the focus, instead of being on the individual, the focus is that the culture can maintain itself. In a sense, it's the real organism, and we are just a kind of cells within the organism. Now, if you're talking about outside the West, then maybe the functioning is more traditional. It's all about, am I a good son? Are you a good daughter? Are you a good father? Are you a good Muslim, a good Christian, a good Hindu, a good Buddhist? It's all about, again, it's about the macro organism of the culture, the religion, the country, the economic system, whatever. And you are really just a cell inside of that. And if you understand this and you can see it, because it can be a little bit scary to see, it's kind of, I find it a bit scary to see the intensity with which we actually are instrumentalized as individuals. Even in a culture like the West, which considers itself to be the culture of the individual, actually there's very strong instrumentalization going on. So there's little advantage to the culture to support you to investigate this sense of self. It's just not going to do that. You're not going to get much in your cultural environment that kind of pushes you to self-investigate. Maybe a tiny bit from certain religions, Buddhism perhaps especially, but generally not, because you're really just being instrumentalized by the culture for its own furtherance. And now if we look at some of the mystical systems that are now so popular in the world, and as I named before, you've got Eastern and Western and mishmash and whatever, a lot of what they're trying to do, a lot of them, I think what's common to most of the esoteric schools is that you have symbol sets. You might be looking at the tarot keys, the 22 trumps of the tarot. You might be looking at the Sephiroth, the stations on the tree of life in Kabbalah. That you might be looking at the astrological houses, the 12 houses. If it's a bit more psychological, you might be considering the Enneagram. And these systems, the ones particularly that are more esoteric, not only are they interpreting your personality, this user illusion inside, they also can be kind of like the tarot. It's kind of grounding you. It's creating a kind of scaffolding if you have to study the tarot. And when I was with a esoteric school, a Kabbalah, Western Kabbalah school back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we had to actually spend a week colouring in each of the 22 trump cards to impress the images on our brain. And looking back, I understood it was kind of creating a scaffolding around me so that me could start to dissolve and I could have some level of mystical experience. Because some of these things are archetypal. The tarot keys are archetypal. Astrological houses are archetypal, and that means that if you really immerse yourself in these symbols, you create a kind of bond with the archetype deep inside of you, and that acts like a scaffolding so that the self can become slowly demolished, basically, or dissolved. And you stay okay, you stay okay. And it also leads you from there deeper. So, most of the mystical schools, to some degree or other, they're trying to get in there. We'll look a bit at, those which are left-hand path, right-hand path, and stuff like that later on, and different ways that you can categorize. But it's very useful to understand that the core is trying to dissolve this sense of self. That's the core of it. And one of the things that unfortunately happens with many mystical schools is that people get very attached to the symbols. And, you need a level of attachment to the symbols in order for them to anchor in your unconscious and create this kind of scaffolding effect. But nevertheless, it's not all about the symbols. It's about you. It's about dissolving you. That's the core of mysticism. If that isn't happening and you're just getting more and more attached to the symbols, then you've kind of, what do they call it? You've missed the wood for the trees or something like that. You've missed out on the actual path and you've just got attached to this, and then you're trying to kind of build up your ego as a mystical person, because you've spent so many years studying these symbols or whatever, and obviously that's not good. It's not good to get so attached like that. The other day, this is my new channel, but I put out a video on self-inquiry and self-acceptance, and I could kind of imagine someone who's a bit new to this stuff and interested looking at that and thinking, what a load of rubbish, I would probably do the same. There's definitely a part of me that could look at it from the outside and think, that's just stupid. Why am I talking to myself in the mirror, asking myself questions and trying to answer them, and then just kind of tuning into my face? What possible use is that? But like a lot of these techniques, when you actually do them and you really give it your energy and you really try, you notice that something very deep is happening inside. And so, I wanted to make this video also about this self-inquiry process to just kind of re-emphasize that this is the core of mysticism. If you're not getting into the self, and if you're not trying to dissolve the self, you're not really on a mystical journey. You might be in the ante-room, building up the symbol sets and coming to learn how they function. But if you're not also dissolving the self, doing something to try and dissolve it, that's not really mysticism yet. You're a bit walking around the swimming pool or whatever, as they used to say. Now, the reason there's so much scaffolding and so many different kinds of symbol sets and understandings and all this stuff you have to learn, like even in the old days, if you went to Tibet to study, Padmasambhava's kind of approach or something like this, the reason for all this is because it's really a big deal to dissolve the sense of self. It is a big deal because the first thing is that all of us really, we are sitting on a lot of stuff, like psychological woundings, anger, emotional pain. A lot of energy is repressed into our system because of this, because energy and emotion are bound up together inside of us. And, we have a nervous system which is repressing from traumatic shock. We've been conditioned by the culture because the culture is a macroorganism, like I've been saying. And so the bottom line is, we hit 25 years old and from there, and we're in 90% repression. And so when you take the lid off this with some of these techniques, a lot of stuff can come up and you can quickly feel like, I'm not going back in that room, and that's entirely natural. And so knowing that there's a lot there is useful. I myself had a very big experience like this. I mean, I did come from a very traumatized background, but I was in India in the Osho ashram in 2003, and I was doing this 3-day who is in workshop, and super intense. You're at it for like 16 hours a day and stuff. And by about day 2, there was a little break for 20 minutes, and I was sitting outside from the group room, and my mind was just like the Vietnam War. I remember that, just sitting there thinking, I have got so much stuff going on inside here, and I'd actually jumped off to do more meditation in Pune because I'd been 2 years doing very deep therapy at an Osho centre in Holland, and I thought I'll escape from there and get into some self-inquiry, into some, meditation stuff. And I got on that path and I just thought, my God, I need to go back to therapy. So that's what I did, basically. But I'm just mentioning this because it is normal that when you start to take the lid off the self and start to dissolve a bit or jab into it a little bit, a lot comes up, and so this scaffolding can be useful, finding a way to kind of move forwards and also to move back so that you don't spin yourself out completely can be useful. But the bottom line is, go for it. The more that you can start to attack this self, I don't mean attack in a bad way, but investigate and go in there, that will determine your level of mystical progress. And the way I kind of see these things at the end of the day with this whole area of mysticism and stuff is like, I think like in the culture, whether you consider therapy or the capacity to really have an amazing life and transcend your background or go on a deep mystical journey, probably there's like 0.1%, 0.2% of the population who will just do that anyway. A few in 1,000 who are just so fired up, they will somewhere just go there. They'll escape from the kind of gravitational orbit of their culture, and zoom off, into go and do their thing. And then you've probably got 95, 96, 97% of people who will always, no matter what happens, pretty much, bar very extreme events, they're going to stay within the cultural fold, And then between those two, where I certainly was like the 2-3% of people in society who, if they're exposed to some teaching or something different, something attracts us to it. And then from there, we can escape from the very simple arc of our culture, what our culture wants us to do, whether it's grafting away like crazy until we drop or just, being a good father, being a good mother, whatever, we can escape from that, and go out into the world. And something I just want to reinforce, because I know this stuff is kind of scary, escaping your culture and going to do something different. It's like because we're primates, there's a lot of guilt around doing something like that because it's written in us to some degree that we want to have these life experiences, the partner, the job, the friendships, whatever. And there is a commitment to those things, but when you get involved in this ego-dissolving, self-investigation kind of work, it doesn't massively interfere with that. I mean, it can spin you out for a while and stuff like that, but it doesn't massively interfere with it, I can go and be a good member of my family, what's left of it, I can go and do that. I can be a good friend to people. I can work. I mean, I work in therapy, mysticism anyway, but like I could just have a regular job as well, and you can still function. Is what I'm trying to say. You can still function because there is this thing where, you can dissolve something and really go into a more deep mystical state, and then you can come back out and just be a personality as well. You've got the option. Okay, cool. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it wasn't too convoluted for you and that you got something useful out of it. Like I said, the core of mysticism is this self-investigation, so it's useful to understand that. Okay, thanks very much for tuning in. My name's Devraj. See you again soon for some more mysticism and the body.